Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel where today we are doing a full-length, non-spoilery review of the Gold Seer Trilogy by Rae Carson. So the Gold Seer Trilogy is a YA Old West fantasy trilogy. It starts with Walk on Earth a Stranger, the second book is Like a River Glorious, and then the last book is Into the Bright Unknown. And in these books, we are following our main character of Leah, or Lee, as she frequently goes by. And she has the ability to sense gold, which is like great for the time period that she is living in. And in the first book, there are some events that happen that kind of push her towards leaving her hometown in Georgia and going west to California. And the story kind of goes from there. So first we are going to start with content warnings. I will say that this is not an exhaustive list of content warnings. This is just what I happened to notice. So first off, we have rampant racism and misogyny that is congruent with the time period that these books are set in. So it does stick to the kind of YA. It does not get super graphic, but it's bad. It's just not good either. There is domestic abuse, especially within this second book. It is mostly physical abuse. Again, still very congruent with it being a YA book, as well as mentions of past rape. Additionally, there's a ton of death in these books, especially in this first book as Lee is trying to travel from Georgia to California. But, there's death throughout all of these books. And then the last thing that I want to mention is something that comes up in these books that feels like it's going to be a content warning type of thing, but actually isn't. If you don't want to be even remotely spoiled for this, go ahead and jump like 20, 30 seconds ahead. But basically, Lee has an uncle that has a very intense interest on her. And when you're reading it, it definitely gives off a very creepy vibe. It feels like it's going to be an incestuous kind of interest. And I just want to let you know it's not. It's not actually incestuous at all. There's nothing on the page there's nothing like that in these books. You figure out why he's interested in her, but yeah, it's still very creepy as you're reading it. So just to let you know. So let's jump into the world building. So I thought that Rae Carson did a great job with the world building. Now I am coming from the perspective of I don't actually like Old West all that much. I don't dislike it. It's just never going to be my choice of settings. But I thought she did great giving the feeling of this old-timey gold rush era kind of setting. And allowing that to be in the background and to shape the story without it ever feeling super overwhelming. Like we were getting into the nitty gritty details of it, which I just really, really appreciated. I love good world building, even when it is mostly background kind of world building. But I think that she just did a great job with this. Now, additionally, I did find it really interesting. In the third book, we were primarily in San Francisco. And so it was really interesting to kind of watch how this city is kind of building up around Lee as she is there. And I specifically found it interesting because I actually grew up in the Bay Area. So I am very familiar with aspects of San Francisco. And so it was really interesting to kind of know that this was based on fact, if not all factual, and compare it to like kind of what I know. I just found it particularly interesting. There is magic in these books, obviously, because Lee has that ability to sense gold, but I wouldn't say there's any particular kind of magic system. We as the audience only really know as much as Lee knows about her magic, which honestly, at the very beginning especially, is just not that much. Mostly because she's been hiding it her whole life so that she's not hunted down as a witch or kidnapped to, for somebody to use her ability to their own benefit. So she just doesn't know anything. She doesn't know what she can do or what her limitations are, or even if she could get better at stuff with practice. She really does not know and so like we kind of learn as she does, which is really interesting. Like I actually kind of generally like that approach to it, but also it just means that like it never kind of congeals into a system. So it just additionally, it just kind of feels like the magic in this story is really important to Lee and her story and her community, but definitely not does not have an impact on the wider world. So overall, I thought that the world building in general was just done really, really well. So moving on to characters, I think that Lee is a great protagonist. So when we first meet her, she's like 15, maybe 16, like just barely 16. And I'm pretty sure we end when she's around 17. But she's just great. She's interesting and she's fallible and she's an incredibly realistic teenager. She is trying to make good decisions, but she doesn't always know what the right decisions are. And even when she's kind of at least heading in the right direction, she's not always effective in what she's trying to accomplish. I also really appreciate that she is trying to figure herself out through these books. So one of the things that crops up is she does like dress and disguise herself as a boy, and she gets found out and she has a moment where she has to decide, what am I going to do about like going forward. And a lot of books that have this particular plot point tend to just gloss over it, like of course I'm going to go back to wearing women's clothing, or of course I'm going to continue wearing men's clothing. And Lee sits there and thinks about it because like, you know, it was never about her gender. She definitely is a girl, but like, does she wear the clothing that matches her gender, or does she wear the clothing that actually like helps her complete out the tasks for the role that she has in this wider community? And I really appreciate the fact that we stopped to like actually consider what made sense to Lee as a person. Um, the other character that we get a lot from is Jefferson, which is Lee's best friend. So they grew up together. Jefferson is half Cherokee. He also ends up heading out to California. Um, and he is a fairly bland love interest for Lee. This is something that I found with the other series that I've read from Rae Carson, the Girl of Fire and Thorns trilogy. That love interest was also fairly bland as well. He's really just there to kind of support Lee through whatever she's doing. Now, I will say he was saved from being a completely beige person because he is half Cherokee and he grew up in this town that maybe didn't love the fact that he was Cherokee, but also accepted him as part of their own. And when he leaves his hometown, he now has to deal with how everybody sees him, which is you're Cherokee. It's not any more complicated than that. And there's a lot of racism that he ends up facing. There's the weird situation of, you know, Native Americans are bad, except for, I guess, like they don't include Jefferson in that. And like, what does that mean? It's complicated and it's really interesting to watch his journey on like figuring out how he's going to interact with the world. Now it's more background, and so it doesn't completely save him from being just this kind of supportive character that's really there for Lee, but it is, I thought, interesting. Now, I think the most interesting character besides Lee is Mrs. Joyner. And so Mrs. Joyner is part of the family that Lee has been hired to help to get from, I don't remember where, to California. She's like been hired to help them get to California. Mrs. Joyner is the wife in this family, and you hate her in the first book. She's the kind of character where you're like, I don't like you. And by the third book, I loved her. I thought it was great. She has this great development that goes on through these books, and it's really interesting how Rae Carson kind of showed that development, because we saw it primarily through Mrs. Joyner's interactions with Lee. That's how we figure out like how she has changed as a person. And I just think it was really well done. And then the last kind of protagonist type characters that I want to mention are the college men, which is a group of 3 confirmed bachelors, as they describe themselves, who are part of the wagon train that Lee is also part of. And these are our queer characters. They don't have any labels because that doesn't make sense for the time period, but from contextual clues, you can tell that at least 2 of them are in a relationship together, and at least one of them enjoys wearing women's clothing, whether that's gender confirming or whether because this person just really enjoys fashion and all fashion. We're not really sure, but that is what we can tell from on the page. And I just really appreciate this representation being included in this particular books, I guess. And then the last thing I want to mention is the villains. And I kind of struggled with the villains because they're very over the top villainous. Again, it makes sense for the time period. It feels over the top for like modern sensibilities, but like in the time period, it's not quite so over the top. But like they're not complex characters. We never find out that that their actions have motivations behind them that are complicated. It's always like self-interest and greed and that kind of thing. Like they're not complicated at all. And I do think that unfortunately, because of the lack of complexity and just the things specifically that they're doing that are villainous, it did feel very over the top, and I think could have potentially been done better. But really, I mostly just really enjoyed the characters and I enjoyed their interactions with each other. So moving into the plot, I want to say first, this does not have an overarching plot like a normal YA trilogy. Usually when you have a trilogy, especially a YA trilogy, it is basically just one contiguous plot, and that's not what this is. It's more like an urban fantasy kind of series where you have the first book and it's got its own story, but the seed of the plot for the second book is kind of planted in the first book, so then it feels like they're connected. And like in the second book, you have the seedling of the idea that becomes the plot of the third book kind of thing. And that's more what this one is. Now, I will say that even though it doesn't have that overarching kind of plot, I think that, that the ending is very satisfying. It feels like the ending of the series. It feels like Lee has taken care of everything that was keeping her from being able to just live her life, and she will now just go forth and do what she wants, I guess. And so it does feel like a very satisfying ending, even without that necessarily, even without that overarching plot. I will say, however, that the style of each book feels very different from each other. So the first book, really, Walk on Earth and Stranger, it feels like the Oregon Trail game in book form, which all credit to Julie for describing it that way. I'll leave her channel linked down below. We buddy read this. She described it this way, and I was just like, I can never think of it as anything other than that, because that is a perfect description. In this second book, Lee is basically at odds with a person, and she's trying to kind of outsmart him, and he's trying to outsmart her, and she's got to deal with it. And then the third book is much more similar to a heist kind of story. So it just feels very different, and especially because we don't have that overarching plot. Like, I know that these books are in the same series. They follow the same characters. The development is goes across all 3 books and everything, but they never kind of gelled and felt like a true series, if that makes sense. Because again, no overarching plot, and the styles were so different, and so it did feel a little disjointed to me. There are, I guess not a lot, but there are some themes in these books that were explored, especially through the plot, that I thought were really interesting. In the first book, Walk on Earth, a Stranger, one of the primary things that we kind of discuss is what it means to be a good Christian. Is it enough to do the actions that you're supposed to, or do you need to have good intentions behind it as well? What does it mean when you do those kind things to some people but are like horribly racist about other people, for instance? So that was a really interesting thing to explore. It did not continue on into the next books, which did make me a little sad, but I was happy to have it in the first book at least. And then the one that does travel through all of the stories is like, how does somebody like Lee, who is a white lady, how do they be anti-racist? So Lee grew up in this town and she didn't have any problems with like anybody else based off of race. But as she kind of goes out on this journey to California and as she's in California, she sees racism everywhere, and she doesn't realize that some of the things that she says and does is racist, and she gets challenged on them. Sometimes she sees racist things but she doesn't know how to effectively shut it down. Like, and even in the third book where I thought maybe we wouldn't have as much about this, we still got it, and it was great because Lee had something racist. There was something racist that happened to one of Lee's friends, and she kind of wanted to ride in and be the white knight and save him. And she's actually stopped by a member of the minority community that this person belongs to, and is basically like, don't do that. You're going to make everything worse for everybody else. Don't be that white lady. And we will handle this. We will take care of your friend, our friend. Your job is to ensure that this never happens again. Change the system. And I love that that was included in this particular book, because it's just like, I mean, it's not even just the journey of Lee learning to be less racist, like less just generally racist from how she grew up, but it's specific to white people and white women even. And I just really appreciate that that was included in this, because it is different. Like, it is, learning how to not be racist for white people is different than a person of color learning some of this stuff as well. So I really did just generally appreciate that. Um, and so plot wise, I thought that generally speaking, the plots were good, but not necessarily, didn't really feel connected to each other. And I generally enjoyed the exploration of themes that we got here. As for pacing, writing style, and structure, this is a very fast-paced, straightforward kind of writing style, and a single perspective. But overall, I really liked these books. I enjoyed so much of it. There's not much that I can point out that I think was actually a problem. Just a lot of stuff that maybe wasn't exactly right for what I wanted from these books, but I still really enjoyed them. And I ended up giving this series 4 stars. So that is it. Leave me comments down below. Have you read these? What do you think? Do you agree or disagree with my assessment? Are you interested in reading these books? Let me know all of it down below. But that is all I have. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!